Imagine a boy born on a small island in the Mediterranean, far from the great palaces and thrones of Europe. His family was not wealthy. His future seemed ordinary. Yet this boy would one day rise so high that kings and emperors would tremble at his name. His ambition would shake the entire continent. His brilliance in war would make him a legend. His courage would inspire millions, but his hunger for power would also lead to his greatest downfall. This boy's name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was more than just a general, more than just a ruler. He was a dreamer, a fighter, a reformer, and at times a tyrant. He crowned himself Emperor of France. He conquered half of Europe, and for a time he seemed unstoppable. But history teaches us that even the greatest men are not invincible. Napoleon's story is a story of rise and fall, of genius and ambition, of glory and tragedy. And today we will travel through his extraordinary life, from his humble beginnings to his greatest victories, to his final defeat on a lonely island far from home. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 15th of August, 1769, on the rugged island of Corsica in the Mediterranean Sea. Corsica had only recently become part of France, so Napoleon grew up feeling like an outsider, not fully French, not fully Corsican. His family belonged to minor Italian nobility. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and Corsican political leader. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was a strict and strong woman who gave birth to 13 children, though only 8 survived. She taught Napoleon discipline, toughness, and resilience, qualities that would shape him as a leader. As a boy, Napoleon was not tall and had a sharp temper. He was shy in large groups, often preferring solitude. While other children played games, young Napoleon spent hours reading history books, especially stories of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Charlemagne. From an early age, he dreamed of glory and power. At the age of 9, his father secured him a scholarship to study in mainland France. Napoleon left Corsica and traveled hundreds of miles away from home to a strange new land where he barely spoke the language. At the Royal Military Academy of Brienne, he was mocked for his Corsican accent and humble origins. The other boys were sons of wealthy French nobles, while Napoleon was seen as a poor outsider. But instead of giving up, Napoleon worked harder. He excelled in mathematics, geography, and history. His teachers noticed his sharp mind and called him serious, reserved, and ambitious. He had a natural gift for military strategy. He would often spend hours setting up mock battles with toy soldiers, planning attacks and defenses with astonishing precision. By the age of 15, he was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, where he trained as an artillery officer. Despite financial struggles after his father's death, Napoleon completed a 2-year course in just 1 year, showing not only his brilliance but also his determination to succeed. By the time he was 16 years old, Napoleon became a second lieutenant in the French army. A boy from a small island had now entered the military elite of France, and this was only the beginning of his extraordinary journey. After completing his military education, Napoleon began his career as a young artillery officer. At first, he was just another ambitious soldier, but soon, the winds of revolution would give him opportunities unlike any other. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted. The monarchy fell, chaos spread across France, and enemies gathered at its borders. While many officers from noble families fled the country, Napoleon stayed. This gave him room to rise quickly. One of his first chances came in 1793 during the siege of Toulon. Royalist forces had taken the city with help from the British Navy. France desperately needed a victory. Napoleon, then only 24 years old, was put in charge of the artillery. He studied the battlefield carefully, placing cannons in new positions no one else had considered. His plan worked. French forces recaptured the city. For his brilliance, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. This was the first time his name echoed across France. But Napoleon's rise was not smooth. In 1794, after the fall of Robespierre, he was briefly arrested for political connections. He was released, but his career seemed uncertain. Still, his talent was too great to be ignored. His true breakthrough came in 1795. Royalists in Paris attempted to overthrow the revolutionary government. Napoleon was called in to defend the capital. He famously ordered cannons to fire a whiff of grape shot into the attacking mob, scattering them in minutes. Overnight, Napoleon became the savior of the revolution. Soon after, he was made commander of the French army in Italy. Many thought this was a small post, but Napoleon turned it into the stage of his genius. In the Italian campaign, 1796 to 1797, he defeated armies much larger than his own. He moved with incredible speed, striking before the enemy could prepare. His soldiers adored him because he shared their hardships, marching with them, eating their rations, and giving fiery speeches that filled them with pride. Within a year, Napoleon forced Austria into peace and redrew the map of Europe. France, once weak, now stood strong, thanks to him. In 1798, seeking to weaken Britain, Napoleon led an expedition to Egypt. He dreamed of cutting British trade routes to India and building a French empire in the East. He won battles on land, such as the Battle of the Pyramids, where he crushed the Mamluks with brilliant tactics. But at sea, disaster struck. Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, leaving Napoleon stranded. Still, even in failure, Napoleon's legend grew. He returned to France in 1799 as a hero. The country was unstable, its government, the Directory, weak and unpopular. Napoleon saw his chance. On November 9th, 1799, 18th Brumaire in the French calendar, he staged a coup d'etat. Surrounded by loyal soldiers, he stormed the chambers of power and forced the politicians to hand him control. At just 30 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul of France, effectively the leader of the nation. From a young Corsican outsider to the master of France, Napoleon had risen faster than anyone could have imagined, and soon his ambition would drive him even higher toward the crown of an emperor. By the year 1800, Napoleon was already the most powerful man in France. But his ambition was far greater. He didn't just want to be the leader of a nation, he wanted to shape an entire empire. As first consul, Napoleon began to transform France. He reorganized the government, fixed the economy by creating the Bank of France, built roads, schools, and improved infrastructure. Most importantly, he introduced the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that guaranteed equality before the law, protected property rights, and ended feudal privileges. Even today, parts of this code influence legal systems across the world. But Napoleon wanted more than reforms. He wanted the crown. On December 2nd, 1804, inside the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. The Pope was present, but instead of bowing before him, Napoleon took the crown in his own hands and placed it on his head. This single act declared to the world, "I owe my power to no one but myself." Napoleon's true genius shone on the battlefield. His strategies were fast, flexible, and unpredictable. He studied his enemies, moved his armies quickly, and struck before they could react. His greatest victory came in 1805 at the Battle of Austerlitz. Facing the combined armies of Austria and Russia, far larger than his own, Napoleon used deception. He pretended to be weak, luring his enemies into a trap. When they attacked, he crushed them with devastating precision. The battle was so brilliant it became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Over the next few years, his armies swept across Europe. He defeated Prussia in 1806 at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. He forced Austria to surrender again in 1809. He spread French influence into Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and much of Central Europe. At its height, Napoleon's empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Russia. Almost the whole of Europe either belonged to him or was allied with him. Napoleon was loved by his soldiers. They called him the Little Corporal because he shared their struggles. He walked among them, spoke to them directly, and inspired them with speeches before battles. He was not just a distant ruler. He was one of them. To the people of France, Napoleon brought stability after the chaos of the Revolution. He gave them order, pride, and victories that made France the most powerful nation on the continent. Napoleon also wanted to build a dynasty. His marriage to Josephine gave him status, but when she failed to produce an heir, he divorced her. In 1810, he married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. This union symbolized his dominance over Europe's old royal families. Soon after, a son was born, Napoleon II, whom he proudly called the King of Rome. For a brief moment, Napoleon seemed invincible. He was a self-made emperor, a reformer, a conqueror, and now the founder of a dynasty. He stood at the very peak of his glory. But as history has shown time and time again, the higher a man rises, the harder he falls. And for Napoleon, the turning point was closer than he could imagine. By 1810, Napoleon was at the height of his power. France controlled most of Europe, his armies were feared, and his empire seemed unbreakable. But history has a way of humbling even the greatest of men. Napoleon knew he could not defeat Britain on the seas. The British Navy under Admiral Nelson had destroyed his fleet years earlier at the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. So Napoleon turned to economic warfare. He created the Continental System, a blockade that ordered all of Europe to stop trading with Britain. His hope was to starve Britain's economy. But the plan backfired. Smuggling thrived. Britain found new trade markets overseas, and European countries quietly disobeyed. Worst of all, Russia, once his uneasy ally began to break away from the blockade. Determined to punish Russia, Napoleon gathered the Grande Armée, the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers from across his empire marched east. At first, Napoleon expected a quick, decisive victory, but the Russians refused to fight directly. They retreated deeper into their vast land, burning crops and villages behind them, a brutal strategy known as scorched earth. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found the city in flames. The Russians had abandoned it. There was no food, no supplies, no peace treaty. He waited for weeks, but nothing came. Winter was approaching. As snow began to fall, Napoleon made the painful decision to retreat. That retreat became one of the greatest disasters in military history. Freezing temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers starved, horses died, wagons froze in place. Disease spread. Russian forces attacked constantly from the sides. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, only about 100,000 made it back alive. The rest had died, deserted, or been captured. Napoleon, once seen as invincible, had been brought to his knees not by men, but by the winter and the vastness of Russia. Sensing weakness, Napoleon's enemies united. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Sweden formed a new coalition against him. In 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, Napoleon's forces faced a combined army far larger than his own. After days of fierce fighting, Napoleon was decisively defeated. The unstoppable emperor who once ruled nearly all of Europe was now losing it piece by piece. This was the true turning point of his life. The legend of Napoleon was fading, and his fall was about to begin. After the disaster in Russia and the crushing defeat at Leipzig, Napoleon's empire began to collapse. One by one, the countries of Europe turned against him. His once great army was weakened, his resources drained, and his enemies were united like never before. By 1814, coalition forces pushed deep into France. Napoleon fought desperately, winning small victories, but he could not stop the overwhelming tide. Paris was captured. The French Senate declared him deposed. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and, in a humiliating twist, was exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. Once the ruler of most of Europe, he was now reduced to ruling a small island with barely a few thousand people. On Elba, Napoleon did not waste time. He reorganized the island's economy, built roads, and even trained a small army. But his heart was restless. He dreamed of France, of power, of glory, and he knew many in France still loved him. In February 1815, Napoleon made his daring move. Escaping Elba with just a small group of followers, he sailed back to France. As he marched toward Paris, soldiers were sent to arrest him. Instead, they joined him. The moment became legendary. When Napoleon faced them, he opened his coat and shouted, "If any of you will shoot your emperor, here I am." The soldiers instead cried out, "Vive l'Empereur!" Napoleon's return was unstoppable. Within weeks, he was back in Paris, emperor once again. The people cheered, the army rallied, and Europe trembled. This incredible comeback became known as the 100 Days. But Napoleon's enemies wasted no time. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed another coalition. The fate of Europe would be decided at one battle, Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, in present-day Belgium, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington's British forces and the Prussian army under Blücher. At first, Napoleon's strategy seemed to work. His men fought bravely, and for hours the battle raged. But delays, exhaustion, and the late arrival of the Prussians turned the tide. As evening fell, the French army collapsed. Napoleon had lost. Waterloo was his final, crushing defeat. After the battle, Napoleon surrendered to the British. This time, there would be no second chance. The Allies exiled him to St. Helena, a remote volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from Europe. There, surrounded by guards, far from family, power, and glory, Napoleon spent the last years of his life in isolation. He wrote his memoirs, reflecting on his career, his victories, and his failures. But the world that once trembled at his name had moved on. The great emperor was no longer a conqueror, but a prisoner. On the lonely island of St. Helena, far away in the South Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon Bonaparte lived the last chapter of his extraordinary life. The once great emperor who had commanded millions now lived under constant watch, with only a handful of loyal followers by his side. His house, Longwood, was damp, cold, and uncomfortable. The British, determined to prevent another escape, kept him under strict guard. Ships patrolled the waters, soldiers monitored his movements, and he was allowed little freedom. Napoleon, now in his mid-40s, spent his days walking in the gardens, dictating his memoirs and reflecting on his past. He often spoke of his victories, justifying his choices, and shaping the story he wanted history to remember. At times, he seemed bitter about betrayal and defeat. At other times, he spoke with pride about the empire he had built. By 1817, Napoleon's health began to decline. He suffered from stomach pains, weakness, and rapid weight loss. Some believed it was stomach cancer, the same illness that killed his father. Others suspected slow poisoning, possibly from arsenic in the wallpaper of his home. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon Bonaparte died. His last reported words were, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine," whispering the things that had defined his life, his nation, his soldiers, his love. He was buried on St. Helena, but years later, in 1840, his body was returned to France, where he now rests in a grand tomb at Les Invalides in Paris. Napoleon's life was a storm of ambition, brilliance, and controversy. He was both a hero and a tyrant, admired and feared. His legacy lives on in many ways. Military genius, he revolutionized warfare with speed, mobility, and strategy. Even today, military academies study his campaigns. Napoleonic Code. His laws form the foundation of modern legal systems in Europe and beyond, emphasizing equality before the law and civil rights. Nationalism. His conquests spread the idea of nationalism, inspiring revolutions and shaping the future of Europe. Modern reforms. He centralized education, improved infrastructure, and created institutions that still exist in France. But there is another side to his legacy. His wars caused the deaths of millions. His hunger for power destabilized Europe, and his dream of lasting empire ended in ruins. Napoleon Bonaparte was not just a man, he was a force of history. He rose from obscurity on a small island to crown himself Emperor of France. He built an empire with unmatched brilliance, only to lose it all through ambition and fate. Some see him as a genius, others as a monster. But one thing is certain, The world was never the same after Napoleon. His story remains one of the greatest tales of glory and downfall in human history. And so ends the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a boy born on a small island who rose to command nations, crown himself emperor, and shake the thrones of Europe. A man whose brilliance brought him glory and whose ambition brought him ruin. His life is a reminder that power is fleeting, that even the greatest empires can crumble, and that history never forgets. If Napoleon's journey taught us anything, it is that human ambition knows no limits. It can build empires, but it can also destroy them. His story is not just about battles and crowns. It is about vision, destiny, and the price of greatness. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to the channel. We bring you more stories of great personalities, men and women whose lives shaped the world we live in today. And remember, history is not just about the past. It is about the lessons we carry into the future.